Welcome. Welcome all of you to this very special FediForum event. Let me introduce myself. My name is Johannes Ernst, and with my partner Anka Moju, who is here somewhere in one of those Zoom triangles, with Anka, we are your hosts today for this special event. This event is very special because we have never done anything like that. As you might know, many people are new to the FediForum community here. The FediForum has been so far an online event that happens every 6 months roughly. It brings together the people who move the open social web forward, the open social media based on open protocols such as the Fediverse. We host FediForum so that we can all meet. We can learn from each other. We can hear what everybody is working on. We see demos of new social web software. We get inspired. We discuss open issues, connect with like-minded people, make friends. That was unexpected. Apparently, so many people have made friends at FediForum across the international borders and continents, and make plans on how we build this network out together so that it is right for people and it doesn't turn into the kind of thing that commercial social media has turned into. So in fact, the next and sixth FediForum is coming up next month again, and we are looking forward to continue the tradition. Join us if that sounds interesting. So today's book tour event is something very special, and it is extra special because the book we will talk about today, this one right, I have it right here, and that just came out, covers the Fediverse, which is at the very core of our very community. If you have read the book, you can see that many of the people in the book are actually on this call, which is particularly interesting. And I'm sure if you want to meet them, you can meet them at the next FediForum too. Quick overview of what's going to happen during the rest of this hour. So first, Roberts will tell us a bit about what's in his book. He has observed the Fediverse and its community in detail for quite some time, and he has some rather interesting insights. And just like you, I'm very much looking forward to hearing them. While he's presenting and afterwards, if you have a question for him, please post a question in the chat. Maybe you can mark it with a question so we see it. Anke and I will be monitoring the chat and questions. And then in part 2 will be a question and answer session with Robert and some of the questions that you posted. We will close at the top of the hour. However, if you are new to FediForum or the broader community and have questions, like questions about how to get involved or what FediForum is all about or what an unconference might be, you can stick around for a few minutes after we end at the top of the hour and we'll answer your questions. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Robert W. Gehl is an award-winning author, professor, and researcher of contemporary communications technologies. He has been following and researching the Fediverse for many years. This is his 5th book, is that true? Something like that. It was published by Oxford University Press just last month, and it is titled Move Slowly and Build Bridges, Mastodon, the Fediverse, and the Struggle for Democratic Social Media. Robert, thank you so very much for joining us today. We are very glad to have you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Johannes. Thanks to the FediForum for hosting me, and thanks to all of you for attending. And Johannes is correct. There's a lot of folks here who I've interviewed for the book. So hopefully I don't misquote anyone. Correct me if I misquote you at all. I'm going to attempt to screen share because I made some fun slides. So let's do this. There we go. And I'm assuming you can see socio-technical story hour, Tales from Move Slowly and Build Bridges on your screen.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. I got invited to give this book talk. I'm really excited to be here. But I will admit that I got nervous about it. And so I needed some inspiration. And so I turned, as so many of us on the Fediverse do, to, let's see if I can get this to work. Is it not changing?
We still have the slides.
It's
Yeah,
not
we're still
changing to
seeing page 53.
oh, well, there you go. That's a spoiler. It was at the very end. This is where I turn for inspiration.
Oh,
As we all do, inspirational Skeletor on mas.to. And as Skeletor tells us, today all possibilities are illuminated. They are in front of us. And I think that is a good description of a core idea of my new book, Move Slowly and Build Bridges, which, as Johannes said, was released last month from Oxford. In the book, I take seriously the idea that, at least when it comes to social media, another world is possible. As an aside, I also want to give a shout out to artist Marcia X, who generously provided artwork that was used for the cover. So that image, the background image is from Marcia X. So this idea of another social media being possible, another social media world being possible, has been something I've been working on for a very long time, since my doctoral work in the late aughts. I've been studying what I call alternative social media. So the work of activists who took a critical look at the Facebooks and Twitters of the world and said, we can do better. We can make a better social media world. I've been studying and interviewing and participating with those activists for quite some time. And I've come to refer to that sort of work as critical reverse engineering. So encountering an object like Facebook, taking it apart through critique, and then using what you learn to attempt to build something better. And for many years, my idea of better was something that would be privacy conscious, or that would throw off what we now call surveillance capitalism. In the early 2010s, I started a project called the Social Media Alternatives Project. I think some members of that project are here. Back in the 2010s, students and I were collecting data on alternative social media. So we're collecting screenshots, and in fact, we have I think about 400 screenshots of Mastodon codes of conduct and self descriptions from 2017. Which should be a valuable resource as we think about the history of Mastodon. This research program took me to some really interesting places like Diaspora and Quitter, and one of my favorite examples, Twister, which was a totally peer-to-peer microblogging system. I don't know how many folks ever use that, but that was a pretty fascinating system. This line of research even took me to the dark web, where I wrote about people setting up open source social networking sites where people were socializing through pseudonyms. So not a particularly radical practice, because that's been kind of how the internet has worked for a long time. But they were consciously setting these things up because they were concerned about Facebook and real world identities and surveillance. So they were setting up social media sites on Tor hidden services and Freenet and so on. Now, throughout this line of research, I've firmly held the belief that the way out of corporate social media surveillance would be achieved through largely technical means. And in fact, I focused on a lot of the technical side of things. Proper implementation of decentralization, or the latest encryption tools, free and open source software. I still believe those things are important, but as inspirational Skeletor tells us, whatever it is you're seeking won't come in the form you're expecting. And that brings me to Mastodon. I first encountered Mastodon in 2017, joining mastodon.xyz. And much as I had with other alternative social media, Twister, Diaspora, and so on, I began studying Mastodon in more detail as part of the Social Media Alternatives Project. As I mentioned, students and I collected a bunch of data from Mastodon back in 2017. And as I write about in the book, Mastodon checked a lot of boxes right away for me. It was federated, it was free and open source software. The design was very nice. It was a very big departure from some of the earlier design principles of older alternatives. And it was, and I think remains to this day, largely free of online behavioral advertising, marketing, and other surveillance capitalism techniques. But I think there's more to the laudable, or more than the laudable technical achievements of Mastodon. Mastodon and the broader Fediverse have challenged my presumptions about what alternative social media might be. So here I think back to my PhD training, which was in part in science and technology studies. And that's a field of inquiry that partially looks at how technical elements and social elements are mutually constitutive. This falls under the label socio-technical. So in this line of thinking, social practices and politics, ways of producing knowledge are not determined by technical change, nor do they purely produce technical change or material change. Rather, those things are constantly interacting. So when it comes to alternative social media, I don't think one can study Mastodon or the ActivityPub-based Fediverse without accounting for social practices as much as the technical details. And these days, we're having a lot of conversations about protocols and the technical affordances of protocols. We see some emerging slogans like protocols over platforms, or even the extension people over protocols over platforms. But another thing we might do is actually consider the human stories of the development of technical protocols. So that brings me to my first socio-technical story, protocols and the humans who make them. And this story is taken from a couple chapters, mostly a chapter focusing on the development of ActivityPub. In that chapter, I talked about this in some previous presentations. I can point people in those directions, but quickly here I'll summarize some of the chapter. One reason I focus on Mastodon over, say, any other given Fediverse system is that Mastodon is really important in the history of ActivityPub. It's kind of through a series of historical accidents. Mastodon turned out to be the largest and most well-known implementer of ActivityPub as ActivityPub was being developed. And that implementation of ActivityPub prompted the World Wide Web Consortium to give the Social Web Working Group, some members of whom are here, more time to finish the ActivityPub spec. And so people now refer to that as the Mastodon extension. But besides that bit of history, I also argue in the book that ActivityPub is an incredible technical achievement. And let's think about the stress test that many of us saw ActivityPub undergo when Elon Musk bought Twitter back in 2022. So while admins who lived through this faced long hours, and I have a chapter of the book about that moment when admins were like spending 18-hour days onboarding people who were trying to get away from Twitter, teaching people how to use the Fediverse, watching Sidekick, graphs, watching the traffic grow, fretting over like, do we have enough capacity to handle this? In addition to the work of those admins, ActivityPub itself, I think, proved to be very capable of absorbing waves of hundreds of thousands of new people, as well as tens of thousands of new servers. I think that moment was a pretty triumphant moment for ActivityPub as a technical protocol. And when I started talking to the authors, and I interviewed 3 of the authors of ActivityPub about this process, I expected a degree of like celebration. But I heard some of that, but I also heard something in addition to a sense of achievement. One thing that may not be as discussed when we talk about technical protocols is the human cost of them, the trauma of developing them. Independently, I interviewed Evan Perdomo, I interviewed Amy Guy, interviewed Christine Lemmer-Weber. Independently, they each told me about looking back and feeling a sense of trauma, PTSD, really intense depression throughout that process as they guided the ActivityPub spec through the World Wide Web Consortium process. It was an intensely difficult and even deeply disturbing or distressing time. And that's a story that I don't think shows up in technical documents. So if we study a protocol, we might turn to the technical documents. We might turn to diagrams like this. We might even go through meeting minutes, and I read all the meeting minutes of the Social Web Working Group, but we may not get that sense of the human cost of the development of technical protocols that we take for granted. So this happy little ActivityPub diagram actually kind of covers up a lot of human pain. So a lesson of this socio-technical story number 1 is, as we consider protocols, let's consider the people who make them and who made them. There's even more to say about the socio-technical aspects of the technical elements of the Fediverse. I have a couple more stories to tell today. And I want to set them up by talking a little bit more about these words protocol and federation. As I discuss in the book, and I'm sure many folks here are aware, protocol certainly has a technical definition. So you can think of it as highly specified rules that structure the transfer of data between computers, for example. But there are other older meanings of protocol as well, meanings that I draw on in the book. So naturally, I turn to my trusty friend, the Oxford English Dictionary. And if we go to the OED, we see a couple definitions of protocol. One, protocol is tied to the official rules of etiquette to be observed by the head of state and other dignitaries, the procedure governing diplomatic occasions, and the observance of this. Another meaning has to do with treaties, meaning 3A, a draft of a diplomatic document signed by the parties concerned of agreed provisions to be embodied in a formal treaty. So let's hold this idea of treaty in mind for a moment. And let me turn to another technical term. Federation also has a technical meaning. For example, in databases, it can refer to the distribution of data across many independent databases, and maybe there's some unified view into those databases. And arguably, we can think of the Fediverse in this way. But of course, federation itself is also a much older term, borrowed from Latin, fedus, meaning a treaty or agreement among people. So here you might think of indigenous communities on Turtle Island, where I'm speaking to you from, like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or the Council of Three Fires. These are governing documents in the land that I'm in now, in what's called Toronto. In addition, the idea of federation is also tied to the term covenant, an agreement between groups of people. And if you look at this, you'll note the League of Nations covenant, agreements between nations or groups of people. So that brings me to socio-technical story number 2, the covenantal Fediverse. In 2023, I was asked to help start a Mastodon instance for the Association of Internet Researchers, or AIR for short. That's an academic organization of people studying the internet. So basically, cat pictures and memes. AIR was no longer interested in contributing to Twitter after Elon Musk purchased it. So that's the reason why they wanted to set up their own server, and they brought me on board to do that job. And one of the first things I did as a new Mastodon admin was help the instance members construct and build our own code of conduct. And that's a very common practice across much of the Fediverse. Codes of conduct are ethical documents that help condition the practices on the instance. But there's really no technical imperative to set one up. There's no requirement to have a code of conduct in a free and open source software project. You're just as free to ignore this as you are to do this. But codes of conduct are very common across the Fediverse and in many free and open source software practices. So where did this cultural practice come from? It came from a person who I saw on this call, people like Coraline Ada Emke and other activists who argued that the tech sector had to move past naive visions of meritocracy. So people like Emke argue that meritocracy actually excludes more people than it includes. And indeed, we can look at the low number of women and people of color in FOSS development to see that that has indeed been a problem. So Emke and her allies were arguing for codes of conduct at technology conferences in the 2010s. And indeed, if you attend FediForum, it has a code of conduct. This directly bright line from that period to now in terms of the code of conduct for FediForum. In addition, this activism happened at a key moment in Fediverse history because, as many of you, I'm sure, know, Mastodon development started in 2016, right around this time. So this code of conduct activism was happening. The Mastodon project not only developed, or rather adopted a code of conduct for the development side, for building the code base, but also for Mastodon.social. And other early Mastodon instances followed suit. It's since become a common practice on the Fediverse. Hence, one of the first things I did setting up a Mastodon instance is we need a code of conduct. These rules provide ethical guidelines for social media use, but they're flexible. So unlike the global, like, let's moderate the globe pretensions of something like a Meta or an X, who, companies that believe their rules should apply globally, instances as communities can set their own rules, their own local covenants. But these rules don't just provide the basis for content moderation on individual Fediverse servers. The Fediverse is a network of tens of thousands of small servers where individuals can interact with others on different servers. So, as you know, what happens if your server is well moderated, but a troll server appears on the network, one that's full of racists and transphobes? What happens when folks on that server harass people on my server? So if we think about the idea of treaties in protocols, Fediverse servers also include the ability to block other servers. And the decision to make that block or put that block in place is often based on a lack of a strong code of conduct on that other server. So the troll server in question probably has no code of conduct, or maybe has one that says anything goes, we're free speech absolutists, which is often code for racism or transphobia. There's no guarantee that other servers will maintain their connection to it. And indeed, we've seen this throughout the history of the Fediverse, where alt-right troll servers have been isolated from the rest of the network. And indeed, as multiple research projects have shown, there's a common language emerging from the various codes of conduct found across the Fediverse, broadly speaking, the promise of active moderation against hate. So while local instances can set their own rules, we do see emerging ethical consensus exemplified in documents like the Mastodon Server Covenant. Or consider another covenant or pact, the FediPact, and I saw Rainbow, Vanta Rainbow Black here. This was developed by Vanta in reaction to Meta's adoption of ActivityPub. FediPact signatories, and I should give full disclosure that our instance, the instance I run is on the FediPact. We agree not to federate with threads. Now, whether or not you agree with that idea might hinge on whether you agree with the assertion that Meta has historically been a very bad actor as a corporation. And as Vanta told me in our interview, she loves the Fediverse for accepting her and for its active moderation against hate. And they contrast this with Meta's Facebook, where they received death threats and where when they reported such posts, Meta did nothing at all to stop it. So the lesson of socio-technical story number 2 is federation is a diplomatic practice as much as it is a technical one. This means we must consider ethics and politics as much as technical practice. Now, related to this is socio-technical story number 3, which involves listing and blocking. While blocking individual instances can be effective, the ease with which somebody can set up an ActivityPub instance means that networks can get waves of bad actors, as we've seen throughout its history. Two feminists, Marcia X and Ginger, created the FediBlock hashtag to help others name and identify bad actors on the Fediverse. And in doing so, they're engaging in a long history of feminist hashtag activism. Later, after years of advocacy, Mastodon implemented the ability to mass import block lists, making projects like the Bad Space or Oliphant's list, later the IFTAS list, various lists, extremely valuable for content moderation. Now, neither FediBlock or just a simple CSV file is a particularly high-tech solution to this problem. And in fact, in our interview, Marcia told me, basically, they said, like, I don't do tech, I don't do code. This was one intervention I could engage in. So people might not see these things as highly technical interventions, and yet they're extremely valuable parts of the Fediverse's socio-technical protocols. But block lists, while powerful, are also controversial. And in fact, this is nothing new. We might go back to debates about Twitter block lists back in the Gamergate period. But really, any sort of moral listing is controversial, and this has been a long-standing controversy. Listing is, in fact, an ancient technology, and it brings with it a couple problems. Lists don't actually really carry their own selection criteria, and they can seemingly expand infinitely. So the first problem leads to people attacking the creators of lists rather than the practices that gave rise to the lists in the first place. And the second problem, the fear of infinite growth, leads people to believe that eventually the list maker will put them on the list and they would have no hope of being removed. And indeed, in my interviews with people like Marcia, Rowe, who created the Bad Space, Oliphant, they all reported receiving hate for making things like FediBlock and advocating for block lists. And given that Rowe is Black and Marcia is Afro-Caribbean, often those attacks were racist. And as I write about in the book, and it's not really my story to tell, but I do talk about this in the book, these attacks did lead to the closure of Rose's original Mastodon instance, playvicious.social, in 2020, incidentally, right around the time when the Fediverse was driving Gab off the network as well. But in spite of this, people like Roe and Marcia and others have given back to the Fediverse. FediBlock is still active to this day. It's a valuable tool to watch for early indications of unethical actors. You often see early indications of spam waves happening in FediBlock. The bad space really is not just one list, but it's multiple lists with multiple admins contributing, governed by multiple people. IFTOS has done similar work following suit and also trying to build in ways to automatically remove instances that get listed unfairly. In fact, by the time I was asked to help start air.social in 2023, it was really easy to implement block lists to make sure instance members were protected from racist and transphobic instances. That's because Mastodon, after about 7 years, finally allowed for mass importation of block lists. And I regularly check FediBlock to keep an eye on new developments. So members of air.social can go about their business of sharing cat photos and talking about memes. The lesson I take from the ease by which I was able to import those lists is maintaining a covenantal Fediverse is a constant process of struggle. What may be easy now often covers up histories of such struggles. So today I've talked about the covenantal Fediverse shared ethical program, considering how technical protocols get produced, how codes of conduct shape Federation connections, how moderation practices are discussed and shared among admins, about debates over block lists and preemptive blocking. And the question remains, what exactly is the ethical program of the Fediverse? As I write about in the book in the conclusion, reflecting on these practices, I believe the covenantal Fediverse relies on what moral theorists call the ethics of care. The ethics of care is about relationships, not individual choices. So it doesn't hinge on the individual actor doing what is right or virtuous. It doesn't hinge on the consequences of those actions as in like consequentialist theories. Rather, it's about building relationships. And as some more modern care ethicists have argued, those relationships can be with people. And in fact, that's how the field gets its start, but also can be with natural processes and non-human actors. And it can be with machines and technical processes as well. So in other words, care is a socio-technical practice. And it can easily be found, I think, at every level of the Fediverse. If people are caring for the code base, they're caring for ActivityPub, they're caring for their instances, watching Sidekick as waves of people arrive, or trying to get ahead of the latest spam wave, or considering new moderation techniques. People moderate and they post, they add alt text to images, they add content warnings, they set up channels for mutual aid, they receive mutual aid, they set up instances with their own money, they donate money to support instance admins. I'm not talking about it much today, but I have a chapter on like, how do we pay for this, and models of paying for it, and how do people sell art and be artists on the Fediverse. And as we know, if we think about care, there are some dangers of care. People burn out and leave. We know this very well. We've seen people shut down instances and walk away. We've seen people walk away from moderation roles. Some of them leave forever. A lot of folks come back, though. And we've also seen people caring so much that they want to express their care through flame wars and acrimony. But on the lighter side, people also have fun. They share jokes. They watch bad monster movies together. I want to give a shout out to Monsterdon. Thinking about the Fediverse's ethics of care reminds me of the late Stuart Hall's observation that there are no guarantees. By this, he meant that any given social change is not inevitable. It takes conscious and active struggle. If we believe the Fediverse is a means to escape surveillance capitalism and the corporate domination of our sociality, then the Fediverse requires constant care and constant struggle. As I like to say, it reminds us that social media involves the word social. That's about sociality, living with others. And that's not a push button process, right? It's done through communication, and communication can be hard. There's no guarantee that the Fediverse can survive these struggles. But given what I've seen in my study of the Fediverse, at the very least, the people here struggling have shown us that inspirational Skeletor is right. Another social media world is possible. And with that, I'll conclude. Happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
I think this is time for a great round of virtual applause. Thanks, Robert, for your excellent presentation. So many interesting observations in it. I was just listening just now, and when I was reading the book, I realized there's just about nobody out there who talks about social media other than our relatively small community has any idea of how different social media could be. And you gave it a lot of terms that we otherwise don't have, like the idea of covenantal social media is an extremely powerful term. And while it sounds very academic, I don't expect it to be, used among normal people. The idea is really good, and we need to get these ideas out. So, and I think we could all do worse than stealing the tagline of his book. We want democratic social media when we talk to all our friends in the world about what social media could be, because, who would want anything else? Now we are going to do a Q&A. So far, I haven't really seen any comments in the chat that says that label questions or something like that. So I'm just going to open it up and ask people to raise their hands. And before the first person do that, let me maybe start with a question of my own. One thing struck me, you talked to so many people in the book, interviewing them, and some of them basically say, the Fediverse is the absolutely best thing that ever happened to me. And so many of them say, often from the same marginalized groups, say it's not fixable.
Yeah.
How is this possible? How both possible?
Yeah, I mean, other folks can weigh in as well, because I think there's a lot of knowledge on this call. In my view, because the Fediverse is so, I use the word non-centralized. There's so many instances. There are a lot of different paths in, and some of those paths are smoother than others, and some of those paths are rockier than others. And I also would point to the danger of care, the burnout angle as well. That we know, I think we have a very strong sense of what's at stake because we've observed a very bad history of social media, corporate social media over the past 25 years. And so our desire to attack that can lead to burnout. And when you also have a non-commercial network, and this is by and large a non-commercial network, you don't get the same resources and support. So you can become an admin and fight a constant struggle against hate and against problems and burnout, not get well supported. And I've talked to people like all sorts of different walks of Fediverse life, so to speak, from admins to moderators to developers to everyday folks using it. And a lot of folks talk about like being burned out, putting their hearts into it and getting less back than they hoped for. So the reason why I flagged the ethics of care is a good ethical program for us to consider is, the mitigation for that is mutual aid, is care, is watching out for one another, is supporting one another, including allowing people who say, I've had enough, this is not for me, to walk away. People need to be able to exit as well. So it's, there's a range of experiences people have had. People could, no doubt, we could spend hours hearing stories from everybody about these problems, but also, as I say in the book, and I'm trying to stress here, people have also found a home online. They found friends. You mentioned, the friends that we make at FediForum, for example. I've certainly connected with a lot of people who don't look like me, who didn't have experiences like me on the Fediverse, and I'm grateful to all of them for talking to me. And I think that's that hopeful. There was something Ro said in our interview was like, I feel, he's reflecting on Play Vicious. He said, I feel rage, hope, anger, and joy, or something like that. And that kind of encapsulated for me the mixture of emotions. And I think it might have been like talking to Vanta. I might have called this book a love letter to a very complicated friend. So I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but it's a really good question about like what accounts for these different experiences that people have.
You're a speaker. You get to ramble. No worries here. So we have four people with their hands up. What I would ask the people who want to ask questions is to ask a pointed question that is short. Sometimes in conferences, people like to give speeches because they somehow felt like they should have been a speaker, or I don't know why they do this. But just ask a pointed question so that we can go through a bunch of questions from a bunch of people. Jeremiah, I think you were the first one in line.
Thanks. Uh, like you mentioned, I came to all of this from a place of activism as well as like techno idealism. And I think that many activist movements, they never break beyond niche circles. And we're kind of seeing that right now with the social web. We're seeing rather stalled incremental user growth. So I'm curious, like, is there a similar activist movement that you can compare the present state of the social web to? And if so, what do you think it takes to break from these niche activist circles and going mainstream?
I am not as versed in the history of activism as you might be. So I think I'd have to dodge the bit about comparing the Fediverse to like particular activist movements. But I will say that early on in my study of Mastodon on the Fediverse, um, along with a couple students at the University of Utah, we published a paper about Mastodon and talking about how it challenges conceptions of things like topology, which we know, like it's not a centralized topology, it's a very different topology. Um, it also challenges something that I would call abstraction. And by that, I mean the gap between yourself and something like an administrative core. So in terms of like Facebook, if you have an issue, you like fill in a form and you hope somebody looks and maybe a bot will look at it. Whereas on the Fediverse, you can talk to an administrator. But the other thing that I think Mastodon and the Fediverse challenge is our received notions of scale in terms of social media. So at that point, I talked to, well, surveyed a lot of folks and interviewed people. And one thing that we heard from a lot of folks is like, I want the Fediverse to be large, but I don't want my instance to be large. And what I learned from that was keeping something like moderation at a small scale, but building out the network in terms of lots of small servers might be the way to go. So what that implies is, were this model to like really flourish, you need lots and lots of folks stepping up as administrators, and that's like that's a particular skill set. So another thing I would say is like if we compare this to like mainstream social media, it's going to be a losing battle. If we think of it its own entity, we see different possibilities going forward. I also like have to like dodge any questions about predictions. I try to avoid any predictions questions. So, I often get asked like, "Will this take off?" I'm like, "I don't know. It's up to
Predictions
us."
are predictions are difficult business, as I say, particularly about the future, right? Oriole, you are next.
Thank you for the book. It's a juicy imprint of the Anglo-Don community, the Fedi-specific problems, and our arguments. In the book, as a historical record, I did notice some weird omissions. You mentioned Randy Harper, but where's Val Wheaton? He wasn't a
Oh,
Fediverse admin, but still kind of big deal in 2008.
yeah,
And very relevant to the stretching of moderation limits and tools.
yeah. The Will Wheaton event. I did look into that, and part of the calculation came from an audience perspective. So how much nitty-gritty detail can I get into about specific moments, and the Will Wheaton moment was certainly an event, versus focusing on kind of broader movements and trends. And so in the book, I used my interest in Play Vicious and later the Bad Space and Roe leaving and coming back as a vehicle to talk about the whiteness of Mastodon, the developments. There really wasn't, it would have been hard to like rope in the Will Wheaton incident in particular in that story. So a lot of this was about like narrative arcs and things like that. I don't think that's very satisfying, right? But there's more history to be done here, right? I'm just going to throw out another glaring omission that you might pick up on, and that's I don't really talk about content warnings. The history of them is, you know, spoiler alerts and then content warnings, the struggles over what they mean. I don't really talk about that as much in the book. I wrestled with how to do it, and I couldn't quite take it on in the space. So I'm going to cop out like and say space constraints. I hope that's okay.
So we have, I think, 7 more people in the queue. So Vanta, you're next. Good to see you.
Hello. I have
Hey.
a question. Yeah. So I remember you did a poll on Fedi that was like, hey, what should I name this? And it was like, it had like ethical, democratic, I think non-centralized, like another option. And I remember ethical won, but you ended up going with democratic, and I'm just curious about what prompted that change.
Yeah. So that poll was one mechanism by which I could think through that subtitle and agonize over individual words. There are other mechanisms by which I agonize over words, like taking a walk with my partner and the dog and talking things through, and also some subtle hints from the publisher that maybe democratic would be the better word. And one little hint, the proof, and they put democratic in the title instead of ethical. And I think I had it as ethical originally. I think the thinking there from the press and the thinking that I kind of aligned with is, you know, let's look at our historical moment right now. Democratic institutions are under attack. And we can draw some pretty bright lines, as you know very well, from corporate social media to the undermining of democratic processes. So in selecting democratic for the subtitle instead of ethical, that raises some of those issues. And at the same time, I kind of have my cake and eat it too, because I have a chapter on ethics and the ethics of care. So even though ethical won a Fedi poll, I think Evan Perdomo runs polls all the time, and he'll say like maybe that doesn't change his view. Even though ethical won, democratic was a calculated choice for the subtitle there.
Philip.
Hi, Rob. Good to see you. Congratulations on the lovely talk and
Hey,
the
good
book.
to see
Really
you again.
enjoyed. Really enjoyed reading that. You paint such a great picture of the tight community of with this awareness of the cultural practices. And if you imagine the Fediverse scale up to a more mainstream kind of society of users who give less care to these practices, like, I don't know, the hundreds of millions of users who use just Threads or Instagram or LinkedIn. What do you think that led to a similar situation like the eternal September, like we saw in the early decentralized internet?
Well, I mean, we can all reflect back. Many of us here can reflect back to late 2022, early 2023, and influxes of folks leaving Twitter and exploring other options, or if not leaving, putting their foot in both places. And we saw like a lot of subtle, different cultural practices kind of butting heads at that point, like different ways of handling hashtags, you know, concerns over alt text and things like that. Over time, that kind of washes out in interesting ways, and you get hybrid forms. So I guess I'm not like the Eternal September thing. I'm not as afraid of the Eternal September thing as I think other folks are. Like it's history in the making. Like we're struggling through what we do. But I think I've said this many times. Like I feel like we have a fighting chance to wrestle through these issues of socializing online effectively in dealing with a lot of the problems. I feel like we have more opportunity to do that in the Fediverse than we do in many other places, particularly, you know, Instagram and meta properties and so on, because we have to do it ourselves. But I'm not as afraid about the struggle itself, like, and the acrimony that can come with it. In fact, I think the thing that's most hopeful to me is that the use of codes of conduct, um, a lot of shared ethical values that you see across disparate communities means that we have a baseline of ethical values that we can use to like build upon and struggle through, like where should the hashtag go? When should you content warn and so on?
Ozoned.
Hello, Dr. Gehl. Good to talk to you again.
Hey, good to see you again.
So first off, I feel like I'm called out by the you don't do predictions thing, because I'm pretty sure in our conversation I asked you multiple times about predictions. But my questions are twofold. One, what surprised you the most when researching the book? And two, history never stops. We're living through history, and books take a really long time to create. Have any of your opinions, thoughts, views changed today, up to today, from when you originally did it?
Yeah, surprising things. As I mentioned in the talk, and I can't emphasize this enough, when I talked to folks who wrote ActivityPub, I expected like victory laps and, you know, rightfully so, people take credit and say we did good work. But they also talked about like that trauma and stress and depression. That surprised me, and that made me really reflect. Like that happened relatively early. It really made me reflect on, you know, that human side of technical protocol development. Um, Another surprise that came up was like the sheer range of different ways people go about funding instances. Like it's, you know, everything from like formally going after nonprofit status in various jurisdictions to like, it's a road trip, you know, come with me, I'll buy the gas. Um, that really, that variety of, I guess it shouldn't have been surprising, but at the time I thought, you know, most people are going to go for like a formal nonprofit organization to like protect themselves legally, and there are, legal implications to all this, and also establish means to get money through donations. And some people just like circumvent that. Um, those were the two big surprises. And as for like what's changed, so yeah, you're right. This book was like 3 or 4 years in the making, and then there's the hurry up and wait part of books where you hand it off to the publisher and they're like, great. And then they're like, have you do little bits of paperwork, and like a year and a half later, the thing comes out. I think that I would wrestle with, or maybe the next thing for me to do is wrestle with like the debates about ActivityPub and AT-Proto and the different approaches that could be used. I hesitate to bring it up because I don't want to wade into it right now. But what lessons can people learn across different practices? And a thing that I am actively working on and actively concerned about is how to head off state regulations that can harm this nascent area of, you know, decentralized, non-commercial social media. So what do we do about these age verification laws? How do we band together to address them? How do we prevent extremely well-funded corporate lobbyists from basically getting laws written that crush an area of sociality. So those are things I don't really address as much in the book. I hint at them in the end, but I don't really address them at all because I ran out of time, or well, really this was a year ago that the thing was finished.
So what is a book tour event without the place to actually buy the book? I just posted the URL to the book's website into the chat. So in case you want to check it out, here's the link. And we have about 8 minutes left and 3 more people with hands up. So that seems to be just about right. Edu stuff.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So great. I just want to say great talk so far. Great speeches, great questions, everyone. I really enjoy seeing community built around the Fediverse and the open social web as much as possible. But I just want to just get your opinion on like what do you think about the emergence of new protocols happening outside of ActivityPub? You know, obviously there is Blue Sky and the Atmosphere. Do you think that fragments the users, or like, do you think that's actually beneficial to the open social web movement as a whole? Do you think we could see like potentially a third protocol in the future by like another corporation or something like that? Just getting your opinion on that. So yeah.
Pass.
Okay. Gotcha.
I have publicly expressed my skepticism about a protocol being developed by a company taking venture capital, and that Blue Sky, even if it's a public benefit company. In the interim time, I've seen people like Rudy Frazier take AT Proto and do some pretty amazing stuff with Black Sky. Here in Canada, people are building a co-op called North Sky. Those sorts of projects that tend to be co-ops, non-commercial practices, funded by donations or what have you. I think that's very much in line with the same spirit of much of the Fediverse. I know very well that there are people on this call who would argue like we got to pick one or the other, that it can fragment, and that if we look at the history of protocols and standards, that can definitely happen. Absolutely. I also know there's probably people on this call that would say, well, we can take this idea over here and this idea over here and this idea over here and create something new and even better. To go back to Ozone's point, history is happening right now. So hopefully that's my diplomatic enough take on the matter.
Okay, great answer. I appreciate it.
Roel.
Hi, Rob.
Hey.
Great presentation. Thank you. I have a bit of a cheeky question, and I know you say you don't make predictions, but I think this is a prediction where you might have privileged information. What's your next book going to be about?
I'm going to give you my answer that I'm going to give quite often. I'm creating content. I'll leave it at that.
No, we don't. Tommy.
Hi, thank you very much. I will ask you a more slightly personal question about methods and research. So I'm a fellow member of the Association of Internet Researchers, very junior fellow member, but still I'm learning. And also a Fediverse enthusiast. And I guess you are both too. You're a researcher and a Fediverse lover. And I'm wondering, to put it bluntly, how can you research the Fediverse without being addicted to the Fediverse? Or better, how do you balance the amount of interesting stuff and losing yourself in a social network, which of course social relations are awesome, and even if it's not made by a corporation to be addictive, of course it can capture you, with doing actual research and being critical about it and like studying it?
That is an amazing question. It's a really challenging question, and it is a personal question. Well, the answer is personal. As I indicated in the talk, I've been interested in this sort of stuff since my doctoral study back in like 2008. my origin story, as it were, is like the purchase of YouTube by Google. It was for $1.65 billion, which at the time was, that back in my day, that was a lot of money. Nowadays, it's not so much, right? But anyway, I watched, this little like video thing where people like putting pirated videos or vlogs up be bought for over $1 billion by a huge company, and thought, what is happening here? And so I was wrestling with like, what do we do about user generated content and the exploitation of our sociality? And that gave me an object that I could keep my distance from. My first book was a critique largely of Facebook and Google. And, that gives you some critical distance. But what I observed is that many people are really good at critique. They're really good at taking apart something and saying, well, these are all the problems. I got more and more interested in people who are like, okay, we know these problems. What do we do? And that's when I got interested in the activists who were like, Facebook is a problem. We need to build something better, and started to involve myself in that. And that's such a small area. Like it's still, as some of the questions indicate, it's still rather small. You can get involved in the social web community group tomorrow if you want, right? Like it's open. So it's a different object. It's an object that like invites you in and says, what do you think? And how can you contribute? And that makes it very personal. And as you say, very challenging. So, I have an addendum in the book about the research protocols and the ethics protocols I abided by. But at the end of the day, yeah, like a lot of the folks I interviewed are on this call. I can contact them and talk to them pretty reasonably. I've made friends with many of them. And that can be dangerous if we're trying to maintain a sense of distance. And so I think maybe at my stage of career, I'm a little bit more capable of like trying to compartmentalize in a way that I wasn't when I was younger. I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer. And maybe like maybe the book tells you whether I failed or not. Like maybe the book is too close to the object. Again, love letter to a complicated friend. But it's a book that it's personal, and that's probably why I'm like super nervous to even talk about it, because for the same reason I mentioned earlier, like I care about it, and that puts me in a dangerous relationship to it.
So we have one more minute left. Evan, can you ask your question really quickly?
Yeah, I'll try it. One of the things about the Fediverse is we tend to look backwards, thinking about a golden age of the internet or golden age of the Fediverse. How do you think we can look forward?
Yeah, I have a bit in the book about toxic nostalgia, right? Like a yearning for some lost past that never existed. There's also like in thinking about nostalgia, using reflections on the past as a means to move forward. So this is a distinction made by somebody by the name of Svetlana Boym. She distinguishes between like this conservative desire to go back to the past that we see with like something like Make America Great Again, versus a reflection on the past in order to build. I guess my answer there would be like, we need more histories. And so if I think about technological development, I think people in some folks, well, I don't want to speak for everyone, but like pedagogically, I don't think technologists get taught about history as much as maybe they should be. And maybe that's a too bold a claim, but we need more histories of these systems. In fact, I wrote this book. There's a lot of history to it. I already got a question like, you didn't talk about Will Wheaton. Like there's history to be written about in addition to what I talked about. And again, if we use those as tools to say, what do we do next? Folks who were like active in Usenet or BBSs probably have deep wells of content moderation knowledge that we can draw on, right? So like look at Kevin Driscoll's histories of BBSs and other folks' histories of the internet as ways to think through like the problems we have now. Heck, go back to radio and look at the problems people face with radio. Like we can learn lessons from those debates to help us think through now. So let's not throw out the past, but let's throw out like toxic nostalgia, if that makes sense. And also like the other thing I'll say is when Threads appeared and Blue Sky, there were a lot of people like, this is the Twitter of old, and this happened with Mastodon. This is the Twitter of old. Like what are you yearning for? Why isn't this the thing of now? Like, why isn't the Fediverse the thing of now and the thing that we can wrestle through to get to a better future? Stop looking for some lost age that didn't exist for, or maybe existed for a few people and, you know, not marginalized people, right? So
I think this is the absolute perfect note on which to end this event. Looking to the future. Thanks again, Robert, very much for coming by and telling us all about it and facing all of these tough questions here. As I said, we will be publishing the recording from this event as soon as we can. If you are new to the community and you think this is an interesting conversation, consider joining us at the next FediForum in a few weeks at the beginning of October. Online, 2.5 days that is scheduled so that you can participate in all the time zones between Central Europe and West Coast. It is an unconference, meaning the attendees set the agenda. Also, if you're interested, we at fediforum.org, we are maintaining a list of other events in the open social web. If you organize one, please tell us about it so we will list it. There's an events page. There is FediDay coming up in Berlin, in Germany, in person, and then FediForum, and then there is an in-person event coming up in Northern Italy that we are organizing as FediForum at the SFSCon Free Software Conference in November. Thank you all for coming. This was a great event. I think we had plenty of people. Let me know what you thought, whether we should do this kind of thing again, and not that somebody writes a Fediverse book every month, but maybe, you know, there's other things we could do. Ideas are welcome. And if you have questions about the community or about FediForum or anything around it, stick around and we can talk for a little while. Thank you.
bye, everybody. Thank you.